Good evening, everybody. Welcome to Salem State University and welcome to the Center for Holocaust and Genocide Studies lecture series. Tonight's lecture is Genocide and Famine in Sudan. What's new? What's to be done? With Alex Duvall. My name is Chris Moriello. I am the director of the Center for Holocaust and Genocide Studies at Salem State. And just a few things for people who are new to this room. The restrooms are down the hall and to the right. And if you could silence your cell phones for the duration of the talk, that would be great. And welcome for the people who are joining us online from Zoom. I know a number of you have signed on to the webinar, and welcome as well. The Center for Holocaust and Genocide Studies is a research and education center founded on the campus of Salem State in 2014. We just celebrated our 10-year anniversary. And it was 10 years ago that we had Bridget Connolly from Tufts University speaking in this very room, kicking off one of the early lectures for our series. And we're really glad to bring Alex from Tufts here as well. Alex Duvall is a world-renowned expert on Sudan. He will speak about the region's history, its people, its origins, and a new round of violence and mass starvation. Alex Duvall is the executive director of the World Peace Foundation and research professor at the Fletcher School, Tufts University. He has worked on the Horn of Africa and on famine, conflict, and related issues since the 1980s as a researcher and practitioner. He served as senior advisor to the African Union on Sudan and South Sudan in various capacities. He's the author of numerous studies, including Mass Starvation, The History and Future of Famine, Polity Press, 2018, Sudan's Unfinished Democracy, The Promise and Betrayal of a People's Revolution, Hurst, 2022. His next book is Negotiating the Sudans, the African Union, High-Level Panels, 2009-2014, forthcoming from Cornell University Press in 2025. Is that correct? Excellent. And ladies and gentlemen, Alex Duvall.
Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be here. It's great to be back 10, 11 years after my colleague Bridget, and I hope it won't be that long again before one of us comes up here again. So I'm going to talk about Sudan, a country where I've been working and living for an unconscionably long time. I first went there in 1984. At the time when the University of Khartoum, which is currently a bit of a smoking ruin, was the World Intellectual Center for the Study of Refugees. So that's why I went there. So 2 years ago, well, tomorrow is the 2-year anniversary. So 2 years ago tomorrow, a terrible event in Sudan, the outbreak of the newest and most vicious and senseless civil war that has killed, we don't know how many tens of thousands of people, has essentially destroyed the state, has ravaged the national capital, and is causing misery and starvation for millions. It may be senseless, but it actually, I think we unfortunately can make sense of it. And I'm going to try and do that by talking about some of the lineages, some of the things that are not new, and then the respects in which what is happening today is new. And then perhaps we can get on to some of the actions that maybe we can do or can be done. There is a ministerial conference in London tomorrow to address it. Just to start with, to locate everybody geographically, this is Sudan, including South Sudan, which has been an independent state now for 14 years, and Darfur marked there on the left. And the river Nile running from south to north, and the two Niles, one starting in Ethiopia, one in Central Africa, meeting at the capital Khartoum, flowing on to Egypt. Now, there's a story, possibly apocryphal, but quite believable, of a young Dutch aid worker taking off from Amsterdam Airport. And those of you who've taken off from Schiphol Airport in Amsterdam will know you fly over those vast drained areas of the west of Holland with their irrigation canals and their grid lines. She falls asleep. She wakes up, she looks out of the plane window, and she sees a landscape looking like this, and she thinks, oh, did we go back No, actually, this is Sudan. If you fly into Khartoum Airport from the south, you fly over Al Jazeera, which is, according to whether you measure it, how it's measured, either the biggest or the second biggest irrigated farm in the world. Run with extraordinary degree of administrative sophistication and calculations, because every drop of water has to be allocated to one of those many thousands of rectangular farms. It is an extraordinary feat of engineering. It was started by the British to grow cotton for the Lancashire cotton industry, but was developed subsequently under post-colonial governments, and is sort of the centerpiece of what successive governments have seen as a sort of hydraulic civilization, an inheritor of that tradition of Egypt, where water is thicker than blood, that Egypt lives on the Nile, or has historically done so. And there is this tradition also in Sudan. Here's a picture of the inauguration of a dam in 2009, which was attended by President Bashir and dignitaries from across the Arab world. It was actually the same day that the International Criminal Court issued an arrest warrant for him for various crimes committed in Darfur, but he seemed unworried by that. He's still at large, though no longer president. He was here inaugurating this dam in the presence of various Gulf sheikhs and others. And the concept here, the central concept, is a concept rich in meaning in Sudan and in the Arab world of Hadari. Hadari is civilization. And the Islamist government, of which President Bashir was the president for 30 years, had what it called al-Mashru al-Hadari, the civilization project. And those of you who are historians of empire will immediately get the sinister echoes, the civilization project to transform the diverse peoples of Sudan into the image of a monolithic sort of Arab Islamic civilization. It also has another echo. I should say, so in response to that, Sudanese civil society said, you have the civilization project, we have the civic project, al-Mashru al-Medini, Medini being the spirit of civic resistance, of civicness, of civil society, et cetera, openness, all the values that I trust we all believe in this room. But al-Hadari has another connotation too. The 14th century founder of sociology and political philosophy, Ibn Khaldun, described history as an interplay, a dialectic between Hadari, meaning the metropolitan civilizations of Baghdad and Damascus and the great cities of civilization, and Asabiya, which is the primordial solidarity, the kindred spirit of the nomads, of the nomads of Central Asia, or indeed of the Sahara. And in Sudanese history, you have both of these tensions and contradictions. You have Hadari as the civilizational project, which is an oppressive colonial design as against civicness. And as I'll come to explain, we also have Hadari as the decaying civilization of the Nile against the wild power, if you like, the power of the frontier, something that is perhaps not unfamiliar also in this country, coming to unleashing its primordial spirit of above all destruction on the centers of metropolitan, cosmopolitan excellence. But the Sudanese have never been able to decide about their state. So this is Sudanese independence, 1st of January 1956. The Union Jack has just been hauled down. Now and the Sudanese flag is being hauled up. Now what is interesting about this is there is no one from the colonial government here. There is no representative of the Queen or the royal family. And the reason was that the independence came about by a parliamentary maneuver this man, Ismail al-Azhari, who wanted to keep his parliamentary, there was a self-governing system. He wanted to keep his parliamentary majority together. And so he said, oh, let's go for independence. And it was 1st of January, and the colonial governor was away on his Christmas holiday. So he didn't come back. And they got a military officer to haul down the flag. But he promised to the Egyptians, we will unite with Egypt. He promised to many of the constituencies of Sudan, we will revive the previous Sudanese state. He promised to the South Sudanese, a very different kind of people, we'll get onto that in a moment, you will have federation. Couldn't deliver on any of these promises. Sudan has been a sort of an unfinished, an undecided country ever since. So let's look at some of the sort of the lineages of this. So Sudan was carved out in 200 years ago by Egypt. Egypt, a province of the Ottoman Empire under the Khalif, conquered parts of Arabia and the Nile Valley, and creating what was a province of Egypt at the time, a conquest province, with these massive slave raids, pillage, conquest, trade. Among other things, our Tufts mascot, Jumbo, was captured in Sudan at this time. Poor thing was a colonial trophy, was transported first to London and then to Boston to be in a circus where he's. And these are some of the characters. This is Charles Gordon, the British general who fresh from his triumphs of pillaging China, came to Sudan and died there. Zubair Rahmat, an interesting character. He was one of the big slave traders. He had his own private army, essentially. He conquered Darfur in 1874 and basically appointed himself sultan. He sort of put the sovereignty of a formerly independent sultanate in his pocket as a mercenary corporate raider, literally. Sounds rather contemporary, doesn't it? And his deputy, he was then imprisoned by the Khalif. He didn't get to enjoy the fruits of his conquest, but his deputy, Rabi Fadlallah, went on a rampage and ended up as the Sultan of Borno in northern Nigeria, where he was killed in 1900. So you have this model of the state as the byproduct of mercenary corporate raiding, in which human beings are commodities. They were enslaved at the time. They're no longer formally enslaved, but the shackles on many of these people may not be so, materially weighty around their ankles, but they are the visceral shackles of hunger that compel them, as in Jacob and the story of Jacob and Esau to give up their birthright for a bowl of lentils. That experience, that havoc of the mid-19th century of imperial conquest spurred a reaction, which was the Mahdist movement, a millenarian Islamist movement headed by this man, Muhammad Ahmed al-Mahdi, who raised a huge army. Actually, it was really his deputy, the Khalifa Abdullahi, who was an Arab Bedouin from Darfur, who raised the armies. And when the Mahdi died of an illness, it was the Khalifa who took over. And this represents, if you think of the Ibn Khaldun system, here you had the nomads riding in from the desert, creating, ruling from the saddle, a mobile state, but also a mobile tyranny. That Asabiya, conquering, tearing down a decayed, corrupt, discredited state, which was the imperial state that had been created. That in turn was defeated by a British army, a British-led army. Most of the troops were Egyptian in 1898 at the Battle of Omdurman, where they slaughtered the Mahdist cavalry with their Gatling guns. And the British established their capital of Khartoum on a sort of Union Jack plan, a grid plan on the Blue Nile. And I put next to it a map of the city of Omdurman, which was the Mahdi's capital. And there you see the sort of organic African city. You know, no roads are very straight there. And it's all centered around the Mahdi's compound and the main mosques in an organic manner. Whereas here you have the typical colonial grid-like city, and there is the colonial palace up at the top. And many of these colonies, you know, there was a nationalist movement, and there was indeed in Sudan. And just after World War I, this group came together, the White Flag League, the White Flag Movement. And after the Treaty of Versailles, the Treaty of Paris, they demanded self-determination, and they were ruthlessly crushed. There's their flag, the white flag with the River Nile and the green symbol of Islam. They were ruthlessly crushed, and in the crushing, what was left was an alliance between the colonizers and the Khartoum merchants, the heirs of that fellow Zubair Rahman, the plunderers of the peripheries. And they also compromised with the heirs of the Mahdists. They gave them big land grants, made them into big capitalist farmers, so that when independence came, when that flag was lowered, the state was simply handed over to these massive vested, you know, trading and agricultural interests and military interests too, and they continued, sort of circling around this idea of reconstructing the civilization on the Nile. But Sudan is an extraordinarily diverse country. The range of shades of color there are as great as anywhere in the world. And there is a hierarchy. There is a different shade of colonialism. It may not be a colony, but it has inherited much of that spirit. And there's if you ever want to really understand this, there is no book of political science or sociology that explains it as well as a novel written by a great Sudanese scholar, diplomat, lawyer, and novelist, Francis Deng. It's called Cry of the Owl, and it's a sort of Shakespearean plot, and you will understand how the complexities of unresolved identity, the intimate enmity among these people, which at its best translates into a sort of wonderful, enriching dialogue, which is this extraordinary spirit of Medani or Medani, of civicness, which was present at the university. At its worst, it is genocidal massacre. As I mentioned, there was a promise at independence that the Southerners would have the option of a federal state in which they could rule themselves. They did not see themselves as Arab at all. Very few of them were Muslim. That demand was denied, mainly because the northern elites were too preoccupied with their own affairs to get round to it. But the end result was a series of two civil wars, one starting in the 50s, which was settled in 1972, the second in the 80s. And we saw repeatedly in these wars campaigns which were candidly genocidal. And the particular way in which they were genocidal was that the government, because it was so cash-strapped, it mounted what I've called counterinsurgency on the cheap. It licensed local militia to go and fight on its behalf. And these groups would have their own vendettas, their own ethnic vendettas. They would want to loot and pillage and enrich themselves, etc. And if you want really to devastate a community, the people who can do it most thoroughly are their neighbors. They know exactly where to go, how to fight, what to steal. And this kind of counterinsurgency is particularly devastating. And one of the reasons why the Southerners resisted for so long is that most of the country's natural resources were in the south, or in particular oil. This is oil. Oil is here. These are the, in southern Sudan, these are the oil pipelines. And this area here is called the Hamdi Triangle. There was a minister of finance in the 1990s who said, let's just put all our investment within one day's drive of Khartoum. This is a miniature country where we can create our civilization. The rest we don't care about. So essentially what we saw during all those years of al-Bashir's government was the sort of the production function of the Sudan government was to extract oil and to a certain extent other resources, turn it into profits, partly for corruption, but that was not creamed off into corruption, was invested in that area. And little wonder that the Southerners opted for independence. But what we saw also was that when the oil boom was at its height, and this is dates, and this is the income of the government revenue. When the oil boom was at its height, could buy peace. It was flush with money. So the peace agreements that were signed, including with South Sudan and other places, were essentially a mixture of a sort of sharing out the cake among the elite and what we call a payroll peace. You get peace, and with all these militiamen who you've armed, you just pay them. You put them on the army payroll, and you hope that they remain, quiet. Which works for a while when you have that money. When you don't have the money, then you have a problem, because this model of peace doesn't work, and you have a lot of very discontented militiamen. Now, this is partly what happened in Darfur. So Darfur, 22 years ago, there was also an uprising. They had been left out of this project. Many of them had been beguiled by the Islamist promises that, because Darfur is entirely a Muslim area, many of them very conservative, devout, but they were not gaining. They did not have the material benefits of this oil boom and so on. And so they rose in revolt, and the government mounted its counterinsurgency on the cheap, this time using Arabic-speaking Bedouins from the area who became known as the Janjaweed. And those of you who followed Darfur, Save Darfur movement of 20-odd years ago will remember them being correctly vilified. They're also actually victims. And the first time I went to Darfur in 1985, I stayed with an old sheikh called Hilal Muhammad Abdullah on the desert edge. And he described to me how his village, his people had been impoverished, restricted by neglect, by drought, by desertification, and how the world that he knew, that he'd grown up with, where herders like him, camel herders, and villagers had this relaxed reciprocity, how that was all coming to an end. His son, 20 years later, Musa, was head of the Janjaweed, #1 on the list of war criminals. I didn't actually know Musa at the time. I knew his brothers, but he himself was out doing some vagabonding when I was there. But you could see how the desperation of these desert edge communities translated into that militancy. And again, here you have, on both sides really, that spirit of asabiya, that spirit of the sort of the primordial solidarity of the group that feels threatened, and the energy that comes from that, which is an insurgent energy. So after South Sudan became independent, South Sudan lost its oil. And so it lost the great majority of its resources and its revenue. But at that time, people knew there were gold, but these low-cost metal detectors were coming on the market. And suddenly there was a gold rush, literally. And the great majority, or much of the gold, was in Darfur. And if you look at the geography of this, the oil was in the south, away from the center. The gold is in the peripheries too. And gold is very different to oil. Oil needs a big infrastructure. So it has to be controlled by the state and by you know, the army or security companies, you know, disciplined security companies under contract to the oil companies. Artisanal gold is lying out in the deserts and in the fields and the rivers. And whatever militia is in control of that area, they get the gold. It's very easy to smuggle. You put a nugget of gold in your pocket, you get in a land cruiser, you drive across the desert to Libya, no one is the wiser. So that gold income turned the Janjaweed from being a ragtag militia into being a massive corporate enterprise under a fellow called Mohammed Hamdan Hemeti, became the richest man in Sudan. I wrote an article for the BBC and they gave it this title, which is absolutely spot on. He hired them out to fight in Libya, above all in Yemen, made hundreds of millions of dollars from payment being paid by the Saudis and the Emiratis for fighting in Yemen. Became bigger than the state. Remember Zubair, that man in the 19th century who had his own private army, his own corporation, who just pocketed the state of Darfur? Well, this is mine. This is what is represented by Hemeti. But I'm getting a little bit ahead of us, because as the regime struggled with the loss of oil and the fact that the real new resources were not in the hands of that old elite, but in the hands of these ragtag militia out in the sticks, they faced an economic crisis. How do they pay for their own political establishment, for all the welfare bills, all the import bills, etc.? They printed a lot of money, and then they had a crash. 2016, the money ran out, made worse by economic sanctions. The US government had promised to lift sanctions. It didn't. We can get into the reasons. There were good reasons, arguments for and against, but the result was an economic crash. Bread became inordinately expensive. People came out on the street holding, the bread became a symbol of protest. We had these wonderful civic protests. Remember that medania, that spirit of civic protest. We had exemplary non-violent protests, which reversed the siege. Normally, if you think of a siege, you think of the military surrounding somewhere. Here you had the civilians surrounding the Ministry of Defense. And I knew from I knew one of the senior generals from my time, because he was on the negotiating team when I was working with the African Union. And I suspected the regime was going to fall, because I spoke to him on the phone, and he said his daughter had just come back from the protests and said, "Don't shoot us, Dad." When the daughters of the military elite are out on the street, the army are not going to shoot them. And when Bashir gave the order, the army refused, and the regime fell. There was a back and forth. There was a military duopoly of this man. This is Hemeti, the one I mentioned. He was number 2, and Abdel Fattah al-Burhan, we'll meet him in a moment, was number 1. And they faced off against the civilians. Agreement was reached for a transition, quite a weak agreement. And as you see there, Hemeti is holding the agreement upside down, which is kind of symbolic. And this fellow, a UN economist, lovely man, I'd known him for a long time, one of the sweetest people, totally an appropriate choice to lead a country, doesn't have that sharp elbow. He was given a very poor hand. He had very little control over the real economy, what was going on. And he just didn't have that political killer instinct. And these two men, these two generals, General Abdel Fattah al-Burhan, head of the army, Mohammed Hamdan Dagalo, known as Hemeti, head of the paramilitary rapid support forces. First, they mounted a coup, deposed him. Then they couldn't agree. And in particular, they couldn't agree on how their two rival armies would relate to each other. Burhan said, rapid support forces, you are to be under us. Hemeti said, well, in theory, but in practice, I want to keep my own command. And as the date approached for making a decision on this, Hemeti tried to launch a coup. And that was 2 years ago tomorrow, and Khartoum went up in smoke. So we have two sort of rival systems in Sudan at the moment. So the Kadamol is the scarf, that desert. If you're in the desert, you obviously, you're riding on a camel or on a jeep. You don't want the sun to get in your eyes. You put a scarf around your mouth and nose, and it's called the Kadamol. So this is the uniform of the paramilitaries of the militia, and known colloquially as the Republic of Kadamol. And on the other side, you get the army, which is a resurgence of that old sort of, dictatorial mixture of the military and the Islamists. This is al-Burhan, all the time denying that he is with the Islamists. But a couple of weeks ago, when they recaptured the presidential palace, which had been the scene of fighting for 2 years, it was an Islamist brigade that captured it. So you had battles here in Khartoum in the middle, and then later on in Al Jazeera, the place I started with, that farm, that massive, great farm, and a lot of fighting in Darfur. And the logic is slightly different in the two cases. So in Darfur, it is essentially the RSF, the Rapid Support Forces, and their allies, local militia allies, completing the unfinished business of 20 years ago, ethnic cleansing, just driving out, especially the Masalit people of West Darfur, driving them out into Chad, taking control of their land. In Khartoum and in Jazeera, it is more destroying what they call the deep state or the 1956 state, referring to the date of independence. So slightly different motivation, slightly different logic to their behavior, but the outcome is not dissimilar. Pillage, they're a sort of looting machine. Massacre, ethnically targeted massacre, punishment, mass rape, etc. Pretty horrible. This is a sort of map of the areas they control. So the country is essentially divided. And actually, since this map came out, two things have happened. One is they've been driven more or less out of Khartoum, so the Khartoum has sort of become more red. But they've expanded here a little bit, and the group in this area has allied with them. So they're, it's a push-pull. The war is essentially in a stalemate. So this is Human Rights Watch reporting on the ethnic cleansing in West Darfur. And it's I don't need to go into the details. I mean, just, house to house, combing, killing of people, burning, etc. And the government forces, not innocent either, a lot of airstrikes on and restrictions on food, and reprisal killings whenever they take over an area. And you don't need to take it from me. If there's one of the most remarkable pieces of journalism that I've seen on Sudan, a team headed by Declan Walsh, who's the New York Times correspondent, published this video at the end, December 31st. And it's a compilation of what they call the trophy videos. So it's all on the RSF side. They have another one which they haven't published, which is less graphic on the army side. These people take videos of what they're up to, and they compiled them. They identified the commanders. They geolocated them, translated them, and this great, terrible lines: "We recklessly do as we please." I saw actually some of these as they were circulating before they were compiled, and I couldn't watch them. And in fact, the most graphic ones they haven't shown. They're ones that you could not show publicly. They locate the scenes of crimes, and then there's some which are just heartbreaking, of where you have videos of victims, survivors, crying out as in sort of in real time as these massacres are taking place. And yeah, just repeated drumbeat of these. I put this one up because this is not the worst crime, but in one of the saddest crimes. When I first went to Khartoum in 1984, I went for the Institute of African and Asian Studies was my host, because this was where the Refugee Studies program was located, and it was run by a professor called Muhammad Omar Bashir, who was a remarkable historian, activist, political scientist, convener of peace talks, etc. And he assembled this massive library of archive of all the public intellectuals of the era, and these guys burned it. Let me just run through how the humanitarian situation has deteriorated. This is FuseNet, the famine early warning system, which produces these, or produced these maps, which are color-coded. So green means okay, yellow means a little bit stressed, orange means crisis, red is emergency, purple is famine. So this is 2019. And these exclamation points are places that are receiving aid and therefore would be worse if it were not for the aid. So 2019, still a lot of people in need, 5.7 people needing aid. But just before the war, you saw the crisis before the crisis, that need was spreading. And these squares are these are the displaced camps from the previous war. People still living in those camps from 20 years ago, many of them highly dependent on aid. Watch what happens to those camps in particular. Sorry. Already before the war, right? 15 million people in need of assistance. By October, 6 months in, look how all those camps have just gone red. They've gone into emergency situation. That means kids are already dying. And virtually the whole country is in crisis or one way or another. Al Jazeera and Gaddafi, the two bread baskets, even then, those places, the places in food surplus production areas. Remember the Netherlands-style landscape of Al Jazeera. For the first time under stress, nearly 25 million people in need. A year ago, the entire country in crisis or going into emergency. And look, Al Jazeera has gone red. That's because the RSF went in, looted, vandalized, burned. End of the year, the crisis just deepening. Now, if you try and get those data today, FuseNet is offline. It was one of the victims. This government is committed to efficiency in targeting aid, which means that they have removed the data systems for actually finding where need happens to be. But there is luckily a UN system. So this is the UN system, which uses the same method. And here you will see, this is famine conditions. These are in Darfur, especially around the city of Al-Fasher, which is besieged, which is the one area which is controlled by allies of the government and is besieged by the RSF. Just a couple of days ago, there were 10 aid workers killed there in shelling, and the last medical facility was destroyed, also in this area. There are hang on. What was that? Oh yeah, this was just the coding, just the numbers here. So most of the population in need of one way or another, and then 600,000 people facing famine. I will just stop with one additional slide, which is that over the years, there's been a lot of literature developed out of Sudan that talks about how these recurrent famines are deliberate, how are a product of policy, how they have their beneficiaries. I can talk a little bit more about both the external factors and what might be done, but let me leave it there for now, and we can take.
Can you say that last point again about that, the deliberate famine?
So this is another lecture. I mean, there is a misapprehension that famines are caused by natural calamity. Very few of them are. Most of them, the great majority, are man-made, gendered language, deliberate. And in the case of Sudan, all the famines that of which there have been about 8 or 9 in the 40 years that I've been studying it, have been either recklessly or deliberately created by government policy, most of them as a result of war. And this is no exception. And one of the saddest things earlier this year was that about 60% of the humanitarian assistance budgeted for Sudan was from the US government, and that has basically all been frozen. Some of it may be resumed, but there was a situation. I mean, I was hearing heartbreaking stories of how in parts of Sudan, there were local NGOs with health workers, that were feeding kids, keeping kids alive. And they got an instruction, don't go to work. And they said, what's this? These, we have kids on feeding tubes, kids requiring our therapeutic feeding tomorrow. So of course they went to work. But not only did they not get paid, but some of their agencies got punished for disobeying the command to cease work. So, yes, let's go to questions. Let's go.
The other Arab states would support or non-support of Sudan, because I'm thinking about the Emirates in the 90s, like Sheikh Zayed time, like with Abu Dhabi, and like what were they doing in those years? Like I see 2003 to 2005. I think about of course, Saddam Hussein. I think about what's going on in the Gulf at that time. But how did the Emirates, or you can pick your nation, how are they interacting or not interacting? It could be a big question.
It is a big question, and so actually, my very next slide. So we have this, now this slide needs some explanation. So essentially, the UAE is in blue, and all the states and military political actors supported by the UAE are in blue or shades of blue. So some of them are fairly light blue, like Chad and South Sudan, but others are like RSF. All its support, external support, comes from the UAE. They deny it, but it is very well documented. Ethiopia is supported, South Yemen, parts of Somalia, etc. They're all in the UAE orbit. And the Saudi Arabia and Egypt have teamed up, and sort of Qatar and Turkey are sort of on their side a bit. And they are backing in Sudan, they're backing the other side. They're also backing Eritrea. It gets very complicated in Somalia, but they're sort of, most of Somalia is aligned that way, but it's, and for those countries, what's happening in Sudan and indeed in Ethiopia and Eritrea and Somalia is very much the third order of business, third order priority. Their top priorities are Israel, Gaza, United States, Iran, and all these big geopolitical issues. But for them, what is pocket money in terms of supplying weapons to these guys makes all the difference. And it basically means that these sides can fight indefinitely. And there are calls, activists call, oh, let's sanction the UAE. That's not going to happen. You can't sanction the UAE. or Saudi Arabia. I mean, they're just far too powerful, particularly in this current world, to even if the US were minded to do that, which it's unlikely to. So any peace process has to operate at several levels, and it cannot work until there is either an understanding between Egypt, Saudi Arabia, and the UAE, and you could add in Qatar and Turkey, etc. But really, it's those three. Either they come together and say this, there's a deal, and then none of them are interested in democracies. It would not be a democratic deal. Or they say, okay, this just isn't worth it for us. We're going to pull out and we're going to allow something to happen. So that's, it's not a sufficient condition, but it's a necessary condition. Yeah.
What do you do? Are they say about any articulate political movements or just they want to replace?
So the RSF it put together a coalition which was announced in Kenya, in Nairobi, a few weeks ago. It wasn't a very credible coalition because they kept the announcement was made that this big, new administration and political coalition would be announced, and it kept getting postponed because basically there was bargaining for who would join it and on what terms, and most of the bargaining was about money, how much they would be paid. So essentially the UAE was godfathering this with its money, but it didn't want to be seen visibly involved. And the RSF has managed to get behind it a fair number of the critics of the deep state and the anti-Islamists, whose hatred of the Islamic government and everything it stood for are such that they will side with these guys. And one of the particular tragedies and difficulties of the current situation is that in all previous wars, most of civil society didn't take a strong position. They were basically ready to talk to each other and condemn the warring parties. They may have sympathized a little bit more with one another, with one or the other, but they weren't going to come out. That is being torn now. The civil society is far more polarized. It's much more difficult to get people to talk. And social media has an element in that. But also the depth of bitterness and estrangement across the lines, because for the first time the war came to Khartoum. So you get the hub of sort of civic life in the national capital. You get people who had been insulated from the war. Even in the worst days of the dictatorship, there was most of the time there was a degree of freedom of expression. People could express and talk relatively openly. And so there was that sort of civic culture, which was never fully suppressed. There were attempts to do it, but it was never fully suppressed. But that changed when the RSF came and they just rampaged through these civilian neighborhoods, took over people's houses, killing, raping, driving people out. And then, the depth of bitterness against them, of people who might otherwise have been ready to sort of talk and seek compromise and consensus. That is a real problem. Yeah.
So the army, the last few weeks, the army is really claiming more victory, and they claim that they're going to get rid of others. So do you think that will happen?
No. What they so the army always has historically made a mistake. So either when it's been on the losing end of battles, it says we must regain our pride, and then we will talk. When it's on the winning side of battles, it says, now we can go and finish the job. And it never can. And it's never ready to hit that sweet spot of saying, okay, we have done just enough, now we can talk. And if let me go back to the slide of the find the slide of the okay. So I think it's possible that the army may be able to go as far. There's a city of El Obeid, which is around here, which actually really ought to be read on this map. I think it may be able to get that far. I doubt if it'll go any further. Essentially, Sudan is going to be divided. There will be push and pull, and I think the army will probably consolidate control of the capital, but it could lose other areas. It's not, the war is not over, and they, both sides can, as I said, can fight more or less indefinitely. And one of the really terrible side effects of this external funding is that they don't come under resource constraints domestically. I mean, one of the things that's happened in previous wars is that the two sides get exhausted because they just run out of money. This is not going to happen.
What do you think would be the best political solution if accepted like that would work?
Well, the one really sort of positive thing that's come out that is still there is that after that revolution of 2019, that civic revolution, everybody recognizes that the only legitimate government in Sudan is a civilian government committed to democracy. Not even these military rulers, or these military generals, claim that a military dictatorship is legitimate. In fact, Hemeti is probably more candid in admitting that than al-Burhan. So there is that sort of opening, and up to now I made a list actually of the peace efforts, which I didn't go through because they are basically inconsequential. And there's a whole series of these peace talks. None of them have been given the high-level backing that's needed to make any progress. And the Biden administration was hopeless, actually. They couldn't decide. I mean, they were caught because on this issue of there are two basic approaches you could take. One is you can say the UN and the African Union should be in the lead with a principled multilateralism, and we, the United States, will back that. And we will then go to the parties that are the external sponsors, the backers of the belligerents, say, keep out. Didn't do that. Or you can say, okay, we'll treat this in a realpolitik transactional manner. We'll go to those directly to those external sponsors, Egypt, Saudi Arabia, and Emirates. But to do that, you need someone very senior. You can't get the Assistant Secretary of State for Africa to go to Riyadh and get anyone serious to talk to. It's just not going to happen. So, and the Biden administration policy from the top was to say to the Africa people, don't bother us. Okay, we have other things to deal with: Ukraine, Gaza, Taiwan. Just don't bother us with Africa. And so it wasn't ready to do either of those. And unfortunately, and so, there could have been a deal worked out at that level. I mean, if the, Tony Blinken had spent a week on it, he probably could have fixed it. He wasn't ready to do that. And quite a few people in the sort of Sudan commentariat have speculated that Trump could do it. I don't think he has the slightest intention of doing it. But in principle, he could. I mean, or he could say if he's trying to hatch a deal over Israel-Gaza and he needs them all, he could say, now, as a side, if as a sort of footnote, an appendix to this deal, just settle Sudan and give me the Nobel Peace Prize. They could do something like that. I think it's unlikely.
So I'm curious because it seems like all the international bodies in Sudan, it seems like they just left it in the country and say, well,
whenever you're ready to come to the table, we'll negotiate. My question is, and part of my curiosity is, given that UN was formed to basically, ensure peace around the whole world, and I know that they have International Court for Criminal Court. Do you believe that they're doing enough in the region? Do you think there should be some sort of a push to ensure that these groups come to the table to negotiate?
So I've been very disappointed in the UN. So the UN had a huge investment in Sudan. It had several huge four peacekeeping missions, actually. There was the UN mission in Sudan. There was the UN African mission in Darfur. There was the UN mission in South Sudan, which is still there, and then a UN mission in Abyei for the borders. So you had all these missions and massive political, diplomatic, peacekeeping effort, and a lot of goodwill towards the UN. And this is exactly the sort of conflict where the UN should step up and say, none of the big powers are going to veto us. This is a second in global politics, a second order conflict when it's not benefiting anybody. Let's take an assertive diplomatic role to convene everybody. And they just didn't do it. I mean, the Secretary General just failed to do it, refused to do it, I should say. I have a very good friend who was working on this file. He was deputy to the special envoy. He just quit last week. He'd been threatening to quit, and then finally he just quit. He said, the UN is simply not doing what it can. And he wrote in his resignation letter, instead of saying, these are all the things they failed to do, he basically said, I hand over to my successor, and this is a plan of things that could be done. And he listed several pages of things that the UN could and should have done and simply failed to do. The African Union was even weaker, at least that has the excuse of not having major resources. But you mentioned the ICC. So there's two issues here, actually. The ICC, International Criminal Court, got a mandate for jurisdiction over Darfur back in 2005 as a result of a UN Security Council resolution at the height of the Darfur War and massacres. And the ICC and the UN did not call it genocide, the US did. I go backwards and forwards on whether to call it genocide. But by the way, I would say that the recent killings in Darmasali, no question, is a genocide. The ICC still has jurisdiction. So the prosecutor can, only over Darfur, not over the rest of Sudan, but he has jurisdiction. So the prosecutor can bring new cases. And I think probably will be issuing arrest warrants, or may have done so under sealed warrants. If I were him, I would keep them sealed because you have a better chance of getting an arrest. Interestingly, there's also a case at the International Court of Justice, the ICJ, and it just opened last week, Friday. And what happened is that Sudan, the UN made, in my view, the mistake of recognizing SAF, the Sudan Armed Forces, and General Burhan as the UN recognized government. They did it as part of a simple bargain. We'll recognize you, you'll allow in humanitarian aid. Didn't work, and it was very naive. But having recognized them, that seat in the UN is now occupied by Burhan's ambassador. And they brought a case at the International Court of Justice against the UAE for supporting the RSF, which was under their claim was complicit in genocide. The UAE is contesting it on jurisdictional grounds because it opted out of part of the Genocide Convention. I haven't actually studied the law on this, and I don't know which way the jurisdictional decision will go. But if let's say the court does decide that it has jurisdiction over Sudan, Burhan has now put himself in the trap. Because if he asks for provisional measures to prevent, you see, the RSF cannot be represented in the court. It's a non-state actor. In the same way that in the South Africa-Israel case, Hamas was not represented, which is a weakness of the case. So the RSF cannot be represented, but its sponsor, its backer is. So if I were the judges and Sudan is bringing a provision, demanding a provisional order to stop genocide acts, the court does not have to stick to the particular demands of the government of Sudan. And the government of Sudan is a signatory to the Genocide Convention. So the court could do two things. One is it can not only instruct the Emirates not to support the RSF, it can instruct government of Sudan not to commit acts of genocide. And it can do another thing, which it did in the South Africa-Israel case just over a year ago, which is to say, okay, the case will ultimately be decided on the merits of, is it genocide, yes or no? But in the meantime, we cannot sit as a court and allow certain things to happen, which may or may not be genocidal, but nonetheless are we find truly terrible. So in March of last year, the court on the South Africa versus Israel issued an order, a humanitarian order, instructing Israel to take various humanitarian steps. Very strongly worded. And it's very significant because there was an Israeli judge on the court, Aharon Barak, former president of the Supreme Court, who voted for it, making it unanimous. And he said, I disagree with all the genocide aspect of this, but I'm voting for this one. Israel has not stuck by that. So, I mean, that's another discussion. But the significance of it is that the court could issue a similar order on Sudan, on both parties, on humanitarian action. And I'm actually discussing with the, what I'm working on at the moment is trying to get the Netherlands government to join the case as an additional state party and put this proposal. And,
yeah, thank you for answering that question. In terms of the bigger picture, what does it look like? I come from South Sudan, and South Sudan and Sudan are not different. We were one country until 2011 when we decided to secede. We used to say, well, we were trying to force a way out to succeed, and we have now fallen apart after 3 years. And after 2 years, and Sudan is doing very, very well. Little do we know they're going to go into civil war as well. You mentioned something about war being really not inevitable, but the politicians make it possible. I think that is in line with what Waal Harari has written in his book. I don't know if you're familiar with his work. And he said basically, human beings in the 20th century, before the turn of the century, when they wake up in the morning, the three things they used to battle were famine, war, and diseases. But in the 21st century, those things have almost been eradicated. And if a country goes to war right now, it will be because the politicians want that to happen. So my question is, it is hard to know what South Sudanese are fighting for and what Sudan are fighting for. Certainly it's not democracy, because they're really not putting weight to try to get that. So my question is still democracy. Is it still possible in these countries? And if it is, what is the outcome like?
well, I think unless we move in that direction, then we're not going to solve this problem. Because we have political systems in my writing. I don't know if you've read my description of both Sudan and South Sudan as political marketplaces, where political office, sort of kleptocracy taken to the extreme, where it is actually the operating principle of government, where political loyalties, offices, services are traded. And once you get to that, and you inject violence into the system, it's extraordinarily difficult to stop. But I think there is a recognition, among the citizens of these countries, that the way to do it is through holding fast to, normative values and principles of living together and rejecting both, you know, violent authoritarianism and corruption. The problem is that we don't have a conducive international environment for that. There was a time when the international environment was much more conducive, and at least those systems could be kept in check. At the moment, it's the other way around. So I think that's,
I just want to say, I don't have much faith in ICC or ICJ, you know, because of the history and the recent history of trying to bring, you know, criminals, war criminals, genocidal criminals to court to have them show up, right? It's very difficult. But also this idea that when you show that map of the external actors, I think about countries that are definitely not democratic, like the UAE is a dictatorship. I mean, I guess I would call it, I mean, people would call it, okay, a sheikhdom. And Saudi Arabia, these are external actors that are so powerful, you know, in this area. And if they're working in this part, you know, in their region, right, in this region so heavily, and they're supporting these actors, you know, how is it going to, what's going to come of it? Because the United States is not going to stand up against the Emirates, per se. I mean, in my opinion, I mean, I'm not an expert in this.
no.
But I'm thinking about your map, you know?
Yeah, no, you can be very confident that the US is not going to. By the way,
My question is, but just about this idea of optimism, you know? Or
yeah, and I think actually in some ways, the UAE is very interesting because, you know, it was almost the last place in Asia and the Arab world to get independence, 1971, and they didn't want it. They wanted to stay as a British protectorate. I guess the Chagos Islands is really the last one, but you know, the Emirates, and they have a, you know, continuity of regime type for more than 200 years, and their regime type is a mixture. I mean, as my one of my professors at Oxford, Peter Lienhardt, used to say, the desert made the tribes and the sea made the states. And so they're, you know, they are an amalgam of that sort of Bedouin lineage and the East India Company. And the East India Company had this, you know, informal protectorate arrangement. It was, you know, as you know, a commercial operation, transcontinental commercial operation using mercenaries with an informal empire. And somehow the UAE which was right at the bottom of that pecking order, said, okay, this is the model we're going to use. We're going to just be on top of it, using the same mindset and the same techniques. Where does that leave, you know, our attempts to get, you know, to bring order? And I think there's a lot of thinking needing to be done, because there is, you know, across much of the global South, there is a determination to have, you know, a much more emancipatory global order. But also finance is important. I mean, what we are seeing is actually, you know, for all the problems of the financial order, you know, the global finance likes stability and rules. And the, you know, there was, you know, I very reluctantly come to this conclusion, but there was, you know, there is a link between the rules that govern capitalism and the rules that and rule of law. It has to be navigated very carefully, because, you know, we all know what corporate or imperial capitalism can do, but it's a challenge.
Any other questions?
Yeah. Yeah.
The map is upsetting.
It is. Yeah.
UAE, what is really by supporting RSA? What does it want to achieve, right? So geopolitical interests.
So I think there are several things to this. I think the UAE has been extremely strategic and proactive in its political economic policy. So it's really interesting that it joined the BRICS. And, you know, the BRICS, the number one agenda of the BRICS is, we don't like the hegemonic position of the US dollar. Either the capital markets or the financial trading system. We want to have some distance from that. We want to proactively hedge against it because we no longer trust the US to use the dollar responsibly. And this was some years ago. I mean, the BRICS came into being in the immediate aftermath of the 2008 crash when they saw just how powerful the US dollar system was. And for all the multipolarity in the world, we had a financial unipolarity and we didn't like it. And the BRICS didn't like it and the UAE thought, we want to be part of this. And so now in order to be part of that, what is the best basis for underpinning an alternative currency system? And the answer is gold. And where does the gold come from? Sudan, Eritrea, Tigray, Mali, all these places. That is where there is the greatest potential for expansion of gold mining, because artisanal gold can be scaled up very quickly. And with the rate that and we all know what's been happening in the last month. These guys were foreseeing it. And actually, it's interesting, those of us who worked on this area were listening to them and saying, okay, something like this is on the cards. And now it's happening. And so the currency, and that's why they're also investing in land, not so much because they want to grow food, but it's land banking. Land is an asset. They're not making more of it. So the more of it you can get now, the better. Oil is important, but less good to underpin a currency arrangement than it was beforehand. And they're also moving into the digital arena. And then the other is strategic real estate, because this is the area in which is the crossroads of global trade. If you think of the Belt and Road, this is the buckle on the belt. And so I have slides, I could find them somewhere, but of the expansion of UAE ports and naval bases in the Gulf of Aden and the Red Sea over the last 15 years, it's quite astonishing. They're everywhere because they see, the strategic positioning in terms of commercial security infrastructure in this maritime space as being key. And the other thing that they were anticipating is that up to now, for the last few years, the US basically guarantees global sea lane security. It spends about $40 billion a year on it. Nobody else spends anything like that. Now, what happens when the US doesn't want to do that? And we followed the signal chat over the airstrikes on the Houthis. And the number one question that came out, or one of the questions that came out of that, everyone was focusing on on aspects of the chat. But for me, the most interesting thing was the clear signal that the US doesn't want to pay for this any longer, doesn't want to pay for global sea lane security. We know Trump is talking about NATO, they've got to bear the burden. He hasn't yet openly talked about this $40 billion bill for sea lane security. Who's going to pick it up? But that's coming. And it's been coming for some time. And the UAE thinks, okay, no one's going to pick it up. We're going to position ourselves as the subcontractor for this. China is, it's hard to say. I think China is sort of sitting back. It doesn't like this at all. But it knows that at the end of the day, there'll have to be deals made because so much of its trade and its security is bound up with this Red Sea arena area. But it's playing this quietly and long.
Thank you very much. Give me a hand. Thank you very much, Alan. Very complicated map that you walked us through. Before we go, I just wanted to thank some folks here. We have our friends in the ITS Digital Media Department. Marissa is on the camera, and Derek, who has been running the webinar. They help us in all our events. And also I'd like to thank my staff, Lynn Blair is in the back, and Regina Casalina, who came up with the original idea to invite you. And just help, people should stay tuned to our site, the Center for Holocaust and Genocide Studies in Salem State. We're running out of time in this semester, but we're putting together a commemoration of the Holocaust on May 5th in Peabody at the Higgins Middle School that everyone's welcome to, as well as Zoom and in person. And also, we are beginning to plan our fall schedule, so stay tuned for that. And thank you for coming. Take care. Thank you.